So, hi to everybody out there. My name is Stefan Komonik, and I'm managing partner at HAKOM. And I will be your host for today's webinar, which is all about how the COVID crisis affects our energy consumption behavior. I'm very happy to welcome more than 40 participants now. And if I'm correct, I've counted 9 countries. So we're really very pleased that the interest is that great, and it seems to be a hot topic indeed. One important information right at the start. We will be recording the webinar and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel. We'll be happy to send you a link to the clip afterwards. So if we talk too fast, which we eventually do, no worry, you can have a look at the video afterwards. Since 30 years, we at HAKOM have been dealing with the energy market, and we have set up an amazing team of experts with more than 250 plus years experience in software development for this industry, with more than 100 companies in over 15 countries already using our time series technology. And it is our mission to make the big energy data valuable. And a large part of our time we've spent with the analysis of energy consumption data. And we have already seen a lot: liberalization, financial crisis, energy transition, and many more and more. But something like this has never been around before. We have practically no historical data for such a situation, which makes any kind of planning a real challenge. I know that you have different functions in different companies. I can see you work at transmission system operators, your energy traders, renewable energy producers, balance group managers, vendors of software to this market, but completely independent of your position. We are fully convinced the first step to master this situation is to understand the impact of this crisis on the energy industry. And this is the prerequisite for adapting and pursuing any kind of strategy. And we must not forget, we still have a remarkable time ahead of us for which we have just as little experience to refer to. So for gaining any insight, it's crucial to proceed systematically and at the same time in a very effective manner. So what can you expect during the next 25 minutes? Ricardo is our head of R&D with many years of experience in data analysis. He will show you how to analyze the impact of the crisis based on data of the last 2 months compared to years before. He will do so using international and regional data from various sources and some very simple scripts in our TSM app. Later on, we will give you some special options for doing all this yourself based on your own data. Gregor Flossmann is application engineer at Linz AG, one of our longest standing customers, and he has been modeling forecasts for gas, electricity, and district heat for many years now. He will comment on Ricardo's findings with his extensive experience, and I can already tell you that some of the findings are really surprising. Many thanks to Gregor for his support in this webinar. He also provided some data that Ricardo will show afterwards. But I would like you all to ask you to please take part actively. If you have any questions or comments, you don't have to wait until the end. You can at any time ask questions using the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your screen. Right after the 2 gentlemen have finished, we will have a short panel where I will forward the questions to the experts. So with that said, Ricardo, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Our starting point for this is the time series representing the total load for the entire Austrian market area. This is data from the European network of TSOs, so the EN TSOE, showing load in megawatts, and we see here from mid-March and into April a substantial reduction of the load figures. Our objective here is to analyze just how much of this can be explained by the measures that were put in place to reduce the spread of the novel coronavirus. So as we know, governments around the world and also here in Austria passed different laws and regulations curbing travel, canceling events, and in general imposing lockdown guidelines in different forms. We know when those took place, so we can examine what happens to the energy consumption at that point in time. In order to have a basis for comparison, we begin with an average figure based on the same time series, but looking back 3 years, which is a good compromise to even out small weather variations. And here we're assuming that the consumption behavior hasn't changed all that much in the previous years. Such rolling average over the past is really easy to implement in TSM with a lag formula. So on offset, using the very same time series that we already had before. So we don't need any additional data for this analysis. And we'll show you how to do this later on. So what we're seeing here is the period from January to May averaged over the previous 3 years, so from 2017 to 2019. And with this, we can take the 2020 data and subtract the average from it, which gives us this green curve that you're seeing here at the bottom. And we see that this difference really picks up from mid-March, which is consistent with when the harder measures were put in place. And also we notice that there's a certain pattern with weekdays and weekends, and also that towards May, it appears to be slightly gradually reducing its magnitude, so the easing of the measures coincides, and we'll go into a bit more detail over these patterns later. Now, to be sure that this change is not driven by other factors, we take a look at the temperature time series for a city in the middle of the country. Austria is not that large, so we can take this to be a reasonable approximation. And we compute using the same mechanism, the 3-year average and the difference to the 2020 temperature. And we see that this difference fluctuates around 0, and it's both positive and negative at times. So with this, we can conclude that the lower consumption in the current year is not due to weather effects. Now, to compare with other countries, and here I picked a couple of headlines from the countries we want to explore. In Italy, the Corriere della Sera saying all of Italy is now closed. In Germany, the Frankfurter Allgemeine saying that the lockdown is unavoidable. The Times with Britain in lockdown. And I'm taking one example from the Spiegel for Sweden, which took a somewhat different approach. And here's a brief timeline of when different measures were enacted across those different countries. We see Italy, for instance, leading the way across the different interventions on the left side, Germany and Austria and many other countries in the middle, and in most cases, the UK as one of the last countries to pass similar measures, but all of this spread over mostly the last 2 weeks in March. And in order to look at these different countries together, we took a normalization approach, meaning that we scaled the load figures in a way that the average load in the month of January was equal to 1. So for all the countries we wanted to look at, they would be at a common scale. This way, we can place their time series next to each other, and particularly the differences become comparable. And we begin with a comparison between Austria and Germany, 2 countries that were more or less very similarly hit by the pandemic, and also whose governments adopted similar strategies to curbing the spread of the virus. And we see that this is reflected also in a similar way how the load is reduced. Austria shows a little bit of an early lead in mid-March, as Germany only followed a week later with the lockdown, but then more or less they sort of synchronize over the following weeks. An interesting comparison is that with Italy, which was hit hard and also very early, being the first European country with a large-scale spread, and also the first to enact the most heavy lockdown measures. And this is consistent with what we're seeing here. Already a week or 2 before Austria, we see that Italy, here the brown curve at the bottom of your screen, already shows a significant reduction. It's interesting, it appears to be coming back up at the end of April, but then dropping again in May. It may be that there's some data inconsistencies there. It may also be that it has to do with when different holidays, such as the Easter break, falls. But still, it's very clear and very pronounced in the later half of March and April, a reduction of up to 25% on the total system load. And also the similar shape with weekdays and weekends that we had seen before. Another case we thought we would look at is at the UK. And here I have to point out that the data from National Grid does have some inconsistencies. I don't believe we have this large spikes in January, but overall, what we have here is a similar picture emerging, of course, with a delay. So we see that Austria here, the purple line, already had some reduction in the middle of March, and the UK follows later, most of it in April. So it's consistent with the measures being put in place later. And this effect appears to be ongoing also here into May. And finally, a case that is often discussed around here is Sweden, and how they did not follow the lockdown model that most other countries enacted, and rather Sweden relied on recommendations and social distancing, but without curbing certain economical activities. And this appears to be consistent with the pattern that we see here in their difference. They began the year even with a lower load than the previous 3 years, but this reverted to around 0, meaning that on average, they're having in 2020 the same load they would expect from other years. We see that there's some fluctuation, but it's not as systematic as in the other countries. So if we take energy output as a proxy for economical output, we could be in a position to conclude they haven't been as strongly affected. Now, we also did run similar analysis to other countries, Switzerland and Spain, and the picture that emerges is very similar to the other countries we've shown. So in the interest of time, we're not going to go through all of them here, but if you have interest in a particular market area, do reach out to us later and we can go into a separate discussion. What we want to do now is to zoom in into a particular local network. This is a large urban area in northwest Austria. And again, we begin by scaling their load in the same manner so that we can a regional load with the country load. And we see that this is representative of the whole country, as it has a very similar structure also with the magnitude of the differences. So here we scale their consumption back up, and just some numbers. They have a maximum load in the second half of January of almost 400 megawatts on a block around noon, and a daily load of just over 7.5 gigawatt hours. And we have the difference in the bottom, and we observe that in the middle of April, there's a reduction of almost 100 megawatt hours. So that's roughly 30% less peak load. And on a daily basis, this reduction amounts to up to a gigawatt hour, so 15 to 18%. For this network, we also have gas consumption figures, which we thought would be interesting to bring up here, as many of you operate with gas. And this network has a maximum hourly load of just over 600 megawatt hours and a daily load of almost 10 gigawatt hours. And we performed exactly the same analysis, the difference to the last 3 years. And we see there's even periods where the consumption is up significantly by over 100 megawatt hours. Roughly, it fluctuates around 0, and we thought this was an interesting effect to analyze further. And we know that people use gas for heating. So here we take the temperature difference that I had shown you before with a reverse sign and plot it against the gas difference. And what emerges is very interesting. We can see that virtually all the fluctuations in the load correlate with the differences in the temperature. In other words, if there's a temperature reduction of 1 degree compared to the 3-year average of the years before, this results in 10 megawatt hours more consumption compared to the 3 years before. Effectively, this is telling us all the differences in gas that we're experiencing in 2020 are due to temperature differences from the average and mostly unaffected from the coronavirus measures. So quite different from the case of electricity. So with this, we go back to power. And here we clustered weekdays in February on the left and in April on the right, and performed the same analysis for the current year and the previous years. And we can see that while there was already slightly less load in February, this was more or less evenly spread. Whereas in April, it's clear there's a lot less load, and it's also interesting, most of it takes place in the peak hours, so between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. We can do the same for the weekends. And here we see that the picture from February is not that different from April, meaning that people are probably sticking to their normal weekend routines. Also very interesting to explore is how does this daily profile evolve over time. So we group the weekdays over the different calendar weeks. And what we see here may well be that already the easing of the lockdown measures are being depicted, since it's far less pronounced towards the later 3 weeks, which also coincides with the economy slowly being ramped back up and businesses starting to open their doors again. So the picture emerges here is quite clear that this is also reflected in the electricity load. And we can do the same for the weekends. Here it appears to be a little bit all over the place. Again, depending on when the holidays took place, when people were away for Easter. It's also important to note that this difference in the scale here is a bit magnified, so those differences are actually not as large. So the case is stronger for weekdays. And with this, I conclude my part of the analysis, and I give back to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for your contribution. I think this is very interesting indeed. I especially like the visuals showing the influences of lockdown and loosening measures divided into the different day types. I think that you can really see how much and when the measures influence the energy consumption. I would like now to ask you, Gregor, to comment on these findings, especially, of course, those relating to your data. I personally must say, I'm very surprised to find that gas consumption shows hardly any change at all. How is it possible in view of these comprehensive lockdown measures? What do you think, Gregor?
Thank you for your question, Stefan. I think that the main reason for the behavior that we see is the characteristics of our power and gas grid, where we mainly have household and commerce customers and only very few industry customers. And in addition, we can clearly see that the gas consumption is mainly used for heating, which is obviously not so much affected by the corona crisis. But still, it was a surprise how small the effects on the gas grids were. So basically, we did not have to make any adjustments to our gas grid forecasts because the automatic adaptation that we have in place for all our grid forecasts, which make an automatic adaptation for intraday and day ahead forecasts, were good enough to reach quite reasonable quality of the gas forecasts. For power, the effect was much larger, and there we also found that this automatic adaptation was not sufficient, or maybe just much too slow. So we had to make some changes to our forecasts, introducing a new corona predictor, which just indicated the start of the corona lockdown. I hope this is a small explanation from my point to your question.
Yes, thank you, Gregor, for your comments. I think this also gives us ideas how to model this impact in a proper way in the future, especially when the loosening measures will take place. But in any case, it seems to be true that there are still many things that we cannot fully explain. So that actually suggests that consumption should be monitored as near to real time as somehow possible, I think. Before we now come to the final Q&A session, I would like to talk about our offer. Ricardo, could you be so kind as? Thank you. We have two quick starter packages, as we call it, for your individual impact analysis. The first one goes out to all of you who already use TSM. It includes scripts Ricardo created for his analysis and 1 hour of consulting at a really very small contribution. And the second one is for all of you that do not use TSM yet. It gives you free access to our cloud-based hosted lab and individual consulting at a very attractive low hourly rate. If you're interested, then for contact, please write a short message to sales@hakom.at, or can also alternatively use the chat function, and we will contact you later on for some details. Yes, I think we are now wonderful on schedule for a Q&A session. So let me have a look. Not that much there. Then maybe a first question from my side to Ricardo. From the point when the data was actually available, how long did it take you to analyze it?
That's a very good Stefan. Indeed, gathering the data proves to be the most extensive part of this exercise. But once we have the data in the system, and there's many different ways of bringing in data into the system, The actual analysis is fairly straightforward. In fact, I have a slide for this. Basically, all of the analysis is built upon one formula that computes this rolling average over the past years, taking into account whether it's a holiday or not, so that the days are matched to one another on the same day of the week or the current holiday. And then a template on Excel that basically matches which days we want to cluster over which part in time, which calendar week, etc. So once we have this data for a new data set, and we just did some of them just before the seminar, it's a matter of a couple of hours really to get it in place. And once the templates are configured, really we can roll it out very quickly. So within the hour, we can get fairly good results that will highlight what we've seen here for the other countries.
Thanks, Ricardo. I have a question here. I mean, that goes maybe also in the same direction. What clustering methodology was used, as mentioned by Ricardo? I think that could have already explained that, or Ricardo, would you have to
so basically, we clustered for weekdays. We took Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays as representative weekdays. We left out Mondays and Fridays since we had the Easter holidays in between, which always have a little bit of a different shape. But in most analysis and also for forecasting, we tend to group Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday together. And weekends, we just put if is weekend, so there is a function for that. If the day of the week is Saturday or Sunday, then they get grouped, and we compute an average of all the days that match this criteria.
Great. I think that would answer this one. Another one, what impact will this analysis have on the business logic of utilities, additional investments and processes needed for future scenarios? I will try to start with a try of an answer. I mean, as I said before, we do not have any historical data that we can rely on. So I think the conclusions might be that we need to really, if somehow possible, near real-time monitor the consumption data and draw our conclusions really very, very flexibly. I don't think that during the next weeks or months the situation will change substantially. Maybe a question to Gregor. What do you think from the point of view of a city utility in terms of changes to your strategy?
I mean, what we definitely do is we monitor our forecasts as closely as possible, which is very easy for grid forecasts where we have actual data. It's sadly much more complicated for sales forecasts because then we have to wait until we get the actual data, which can be even weeks or months. And this is a real problem for us.
Yes, I think it stays a real problem. I mean, this analysis can contribute to more insight in understanding how the impact actually looks like, but it will not answer all the questions for the future. But we still need to really closely monitor the situation. We've seen another question, maybe from UK. Electricity consumption in UK is much more weather sensitive. This goes out to Ricardo, I guess. Do you have a similar comparison of temperatures in UK the years before? I think you thought about this too.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah, I actually left this one out.
This one.
I thought we would be over time, just like we did with the temperature for Austria. We can take a temperature time series from the UK. Here I'm using Heathrow, and we're comparing the temperature in 2020 to the previous 3 years, and we see that it's fluctuating around zero. So there's times in April where it was substantially warmer, substantially colder. So even though this certainly had an effect on the energy consumption, and a true analysis should have first taken out the effect of the weather, this is something, those of you using the Metalogic MP Energy tool, you can create scenarios and reforecast this period with a different weather predictor. We're fairly certain that the weather was not the main driving factor for the load reduction.
Okay, Carlo, thanks. have another one for Gregor. The question is, what are the forecasting models used by Linz AG? Statistical time series models? I mean, I could also start with an answer, but let's take it from first hand. I think it's better. You need to unmute.
Okay, sorry. So we're using statistical learning models, especially regression, and to some extent also artificial neural networks for our forecasts.
Okay, very good.
Maybe in this direction, also to Gregor, can you see whether this corona predictor that you introduced is showing any significance in the models and how much significance it is being displayed? Is it?
So far for electricity, we've seen that for some days the total grid consumption goes down to about 10%, and by this simple corona predictor, most of this change is covered by the model. Of course, it takes a few days for the model to learn the influence of this predictor, but I would say within at latest 1 week, the model really reacts in the correct way to handle the new situation.
It's another question. How did you model the corona predictor you mentioned before? Gregor, could you elaborate on that? By unmuting before, please.
Sorry, I always forget that. It is a very simple daily time series, which just contains the values 1, which means corona crisis, and 0, which means no corona crisis. And the only thing I did, I excluded the weekends and holidays. So just the normal working days are marked with corona crisis since the beginning of the lockdown.
Great.
And do you foresee this predictor taking values between 0 and 1 in the next weeks, maybe 0.5 or 0.33, depending on how the measures get softened?
Yes, we are just checking this, and most likely this will be the ideal solution.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. With respect to the time, there's still one question left, and I will read it out, but I will answer it with our last slide, actually. The question is, how did the situation impact the adaptation of power forecast? Are completely new models needed, or already existing forecast models flexible enough by just tweaking some parameters? Are there recommendations how to deal with it in terms of algorithms, ARIMA, ANN, and so on? Yes, that's a perfect question right now for our last slide, because we will do a follow-up and we will do another webinar on the, it will focus on modeling consumption forecasts under the challenging circumstances we are right in now. So we will hopefully then answer your question. So now at the very end, for this particular new upcoming webinar, we will also invite experts from other partners again, and we would be very pleased to welcome you there too. So we are at the end now, just in time. And I thank very much Gregor and Ricardo for your contribution. And thanks to all of you out there for joining us. I hope you really liked it. All the best from Vienna. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye.